The sea has always been a stage for human drama, a vast, unpredictable battlefield where empires rose and fell, and where the fate of nations was decided not on solid ground, but on the shifting waves. Picture this, a fleet of wooden ships, their sails billowing in the wind, their decks crowded with warriors clutching swords and shields, their eyes fixed on the horizon where their destiny awaits. This was the world of medieval naval warfare, a realm of courage, cunning, and chaos that history has often overlooked. While we're familiar with the great land battles of the Middle Ages, the clashes of knights and castles, the stories of these sea battles remain shrouded in mist, waiting to be rediscovered. Today, we're setting sail into the past to uncover 25 epic naval battles from the medieval era that you've likely never heard of. These aren't just forgotten skirmishes, they're pivotal moments that shaped the course of history, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean. Imagine Viking longships slicing through the waves, their dragon-headed prows striking fear into coastal villages. Picture the fierce naval duels between rival Italian city-states, where the balance of power shifted with every oar stroke. These battles weren't just about brute force, they were tests of strategy, innovation, and sheer human will, where a single mistake could send an entire fleet to the depths. What makes these clashes so fascinating isn't just the scale of the conflict, but the ripple effects they had across centuries. A victory at sea could mean the difference between a kingdom's survival and its collapse, between a culture's dominance and its disappearance. By the time we're done, you'll see how these overlooked battles influenced trade routes, sparked technological advancements, and even redrawn the maps of empires. So ready your sea legs and prepare for a journey into the heart of medieval naval warfare, where every wave tells a story and every battle holds a lesson. The past is waiting, and it's far more thrilling than you ever imagined. The year was 717, and the greatest naval siege of the medieval world was about to unfold. Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, stood as the last Christian bulwark against the relentless expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate. For months, an overwhelming Arab fleet, some ancient sources claim over 2,000 ships, had blockaded the city, their sails blotting out the horizon. The Byzantines were outnumbered, outgunned, and seemingly doomed. But what the invaders didn't know was that Emperor Leo III had a terrifying ace up his sleeve, a weapon so devastating it would rewrite the rules of naval warfare forever. Greek fire was unlike anything the world had seen, a mysterious, sticky liquid that burned even on water. It could turn entire ships into floating torches with a single blast. When the Umayyad fleet pressed their attack, Byzantine ships equipped with bronze siphons unleashed hell upon the waves. Imagine the scene: flames leaping from ship to ship, the night sky glowing orange as terrified sailors plunged into the sea to escape the inescapable fire. The Arabs, who had never faced such a weapon, watched in horror as their mighty armada was reduced to smoldering wreckage. This wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point in history. Had Constantinople fallen, the Umayyads might have surged deeper into Europe, altering the continent's cultural and religious landscape forever. Instead, Leo's victory preserved Byzantine power for centuries and demonstrated how innovation could triumph over sheer numbers. The secret formula for Greek fire was so closely guarded that its exact composition remains lost to this day, a testament to how fiercely the Byzantines protected their advantage. Yet beyond the flames and the glory lies a deeper lesson: the power of desperation. The Byzantines weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for survival. Their ingenuity under pressure didn't just save a city, it saved a civilization. And while history books often overlook this epic clash, its echoes still ripple through time, reminding us that sometimes the most pivotal battles aren't fought on land, but on the unforgiving sea. The Baltic Sea in the year 1000 was no place for the faint of heart, a battleground where Viking kings played for the highest stakes, where loyalty was as fickle as the wind, and where one man's ambition would collide with the vengeance of his rivals. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, a ruler as bold as he was brash, had spent years carving out his kingdom with fire and steel, but his enemies were closing in. On one side, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, hungry for revenge after Olaf's raids, humiliated him. On the other, Olaf Skirtkonung of Sweden, eager to curb Norway's growing power. Together, they set a trap in the treacherous waters near the island of Esvalda, and Olaf sailed straight into it. The sagas tell us it began with deception. A smaller fleet of Danish ships, their sails tattered and their crews playing the part of weary merchants, lured Olaf's mighty longships into the narrow strait. Then, like wolves emerging from the fog, the full might of the allied forces descended upon him. Olaf's flagship, the legendary Ormenlange, a vessel so massive it was said to resemble a sea serpent, became the heart of the struggle. The fighting was fierce, a chaos of grappling hooks, splintering oars, and warriors locked in desperate combat. The sagas paint a vivid picture: Olaf, clad in gilded armor, standing defiant on the deck as arrows darken the sky, his men falling one by one around him. What makes Esvalda so gripping isn't just the bloodshed, it's the aftermath. With Olaf's death, Norway was carved up like a feast among his rivals, its unity shattered for a generation. The battle reshaped the balance of power in the north, proving that even the mightiest Viking king could fall to cunning and coalition. Yet there's a deeper irony here. Olaf, a man who had built his legend on surprise attacks and ruthless raids, was undone by the very tactics he'd mastered. The legacy of Esvalda lingers not just in history books, but in the very idea of Viking naval dominance. These weren't just ships, they were floating fortresses, extensions of a king's will, capable of carrying not just warriors but entire dynasties to glory or ruin. And while we often picture Vikings raiding monasteries or trading furs, Esvalda reminds us that their greatest dramas played out on the waves, where a single battle could rewrite the future of nations. The waters off the Tuscan coast boiled with chaos in the summer of 1284, as two of medieval Italy's mightiest maritime republics clashed in a battle that would reshape the Mediterranean. For centuries, Pisa and Genoa had been locked in a bitter rivalry, their fortunes built on trade, their pride measured in the number of ships they commanded. But at Meloria, this simmering tension erupted into total war. The Pisans, confident in their naval prowess, sailed out to meet the Genoese with a fleet of around 70 galleys, only to find themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Genoa's admiral, Oberto Doria, had spent years studying Pisa's tactics. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their pride. Luring the Pisans into open water, he split his larger force into two divisions, using the wind and currents to his advantage. As the battle raged, Genoa's crossbowmen rained death from towering forecastles, while their galleys smashed into Pisan hulls with brutal precision. The turning point came when the Genoese flanking force crashed into the Pisan rear, trapping them in a deadly pincer. Panic spread through the Pisan ranks as ship after ship was boarded, burned, or sent to the seabed. By day's end, the once proud Pisan fleet was reduced to splinters, with thousands of men captured or drowned. What makes Meloria so significant isn't just the scale of the destruction, it's the aftermath. Pisa never fully recovered. Once a dominant force in Mediterranean trade, the Republic saw its influence wither, its coffers drained by the cost of defeat. Genoa, meanwhile, ascended to new heights, its merchants weaving a web of commerce from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. The battle didn't just decide the fate of two cities, it shifted the balance of power in an entire region. Yet there's a deeper lesson here about the fragility of empires built on the sea. Pisa's downfall wasn't just about lost ships, it was about lost confidence. A single defeat eroded centuries of prestige, proving that even the mightiest maritime power could be undone by a combination of hubris and superior strategy. And while Meloria might be a footnote in broader medieval history, its echoes remind us how quickly tides can turn and how fiercely the winds of fortune can shift. The summer of 1340 brought a storm of arrows and blood to the waters off Sluys, where King Edward III of England faced down a French fleet so vast its masts were said to resemble a forest. This wasn't just another clash at sea, it was the opening gambit of the 100 Years' War, a battle that would prove England's naval dominance and set the tone for decades of conflict. The French had gathered nearly 200 ships, their decks crowded with knights in gleaming armor, confident that sheer numbers would crush the English invaders. But confidence, as history often shows, can be a fatal miscalculation. Edward's strategy was as bold as it was brutal. While the French had chained their ships together to create floating fortresses, a tactic meant to prevent boarding, they'd unknowingly turned themselves into targets. English longbowmen perched on the decks of smaller, more agile vessels unleashed volley after volley into the packed French ranks. The effect was catastrophic. Arrows rained down like steel hail, piercing armor, sails, and flesh alike. Trapped on their immobilized ships, the French couldn't maneuver, couldn't retreat, and couldn't escape the slaughter. By nightfall, the once proud fleet was a graveyard of shattered hulls and drowned men, with chroniclers claiming the sea ran red for miles. What makes Sluys so pivotal isn't just the scale of the victory, it's the ripple effects that followed. With the French navy decimated, England gained unchallenged control of the English Channel, turning it into a highway for troops and supplies. This dominance allowed Edward to launch invasions at will, securing footholds in Normandy and Brittany that would shape the war's early campaigns. Yet for all its strategic importance, Sluys remains oddly absent from popular memory, overshadowed by the land battles that followed. There's a cruel irony in that obscurity. The French defeat at Sluys wasn't just a failure of tactics, it was a failure of imagination. Chaining their ships might have seemed like a clever defensive move, but it ignored the brutal realities of naval warfare. Flexibility and firepower win battles, not static defiance. Edward understood this, leveraging the longbow's lethal range to turn the French strength into their greatest weakness. The legacy of Sluys lingers not just in the annals of war, but in the very nature of naval power. It was a battle that proved control of the sea could decide the fate of nations, a lesson empires would relearn for centuries to come. And while the names Crecy and Agincourt might echo louder in history books, it was here, in the bloodied waters off Flanders, that England first proved it could punch far above its weight and change the course of a war with a single, devastating strike. Long before the clash of galleys at Lepanto in 1571 became legendary, another battle in the same waters 2 centuries earlier quietly shaped the destiny of the Mediterranean. In 1354, Venice, the Queen of the Adriatic, faced off against a fledgling Ottoman navy, a force still testing its strength against the maritime giants of the age. What unfolded was less a decisive victory than a brutal lesson, one that would echo through the centuries. The Ottomans, led by the ambitious Admiral Suleiman Pasha, had been raiding Venetian territories with growing audacity, their sleek galleys striking fear into coastal towns. But when they met the full might of Venice's seasoned fleet near Lepanto, the result was a slaughter. The Venetians, masters of naval discipline and firepower, cut through the Ottoman ranks with methodical precision, leaving the sea littered with shattered hulls and the dreams of a nascent empire. Yet defeat can sometimes be more instructive than victory. The Ottomans, though bloodied, walked away with something far more valuable than a triumph. They gained insight. This battle exposed the gaps in their tactics, the weaknesses in their ship design, and the sheer scale of what it would take to challenge the Mediterranean's established powers. Over the next decades, they rebuilt, refined, and reimagined their navy, incorporating Venetian techniques while forging their own innovations. The lesson of Lepanto in 1354 wasn't just about loss, it was about adaptation. Venice, meanwhile, celebrated a victory that would prove bittersweet. They had humbled the Ottomans, but they'd also glimpsed the future. The hunger in their adversaries' eyes, the relentless drive to improve it was a warning. This skirmish, often overshadowed by the epic 16th century battle, was the first ripple of a tidal wave. The Ottomans would return, stronger and smarter, turning the Mediterranean into a battleground for generations. What makes this forgotten Lepanto so fascinating isn't the scale of the fight, but the scale of its consequences. It was here that the Ottomans learned the rules of the game and began rewriting them. And while history remembers the later clash as the definitive showdown, it was this quieter, earlier struggle that set the pieces in motion. Sometimes, the battles that slip through the cracks of memory are the ones that change the world. The sun had barely risen over the Ionian Sea in August 1499 when history quietly shifted its course. Near the port of Zontio, two of the Mediterranean's mightiest fleets, Venice and the Ottoman Empire, clashed in what would become the first naval battle where gunpowder artillery took center stage. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was the birth pangs of a new era where the thunder of cannons would eventually drown out the clang of swords on deck. The Venetians, masters of maritime tradition, had spent centuries perfecting the art of boarding actions and close-quarters combat. Their galleys, sleek and swift, were designed to close the gap and unleash armored marines onto enemy decks. But the Ottomans, under the command of Admiral Kemal Reis, had a different vision. Their ships carried something revolutionary, heavy, ship-mounted guns capable of striking from a distance. What unfolded was a chaotic hybrid of old and new. Venetian crews, trained for hand-to-hand fighting, found themselves under a hail of iron shot that shattered oars and hulls before they could even grapple. Ottoman gunners, though still clumsy with their aim, demonstrated the terrifying potential of artillery at sea. Yet for all the smoke and noise, the battle wasn't decided by cannons alone. When the fleets finally collided, it was still the boarding parties, the men with pikes and axes, who determined the outcome. The Ottomans, leveraging their initial barrage, swarmed Venetian decks in the chaos, turning the tide in their favor. Zontio's true significance lies not in who won or lost, but in the warning it sounded. For centuries, naval battles had been decided by muscle and maneuver, by the strength of a crew's arms and the skill of its rowers. Now, for the first time, the rules were changing. The Venetians, though they clung to tradition, couldn't ignore the lesson. The sea was no longer a stage for warriors alone. It belonged to the engineers, the gunners, the men who understood that victory could be measured in pounds of powder and inches of iron. Yet the transition wasn't immediate. Old habits die hard, and for decades afterward, admirals would still rely on boarding as their ultimate weapon. But the seed had been planted. Zontio was the moment naval warfare began its slow, bloody evolution from a contest of brute force to one of technical precision. And while later battles like Preveza or Lepanto would capture more attention, it was here, in these forgotten waters, that the age of sail and shot truly began. The sea would never sound the same again. The waters of the Gulf of Naples churned with violence in the summer of 1287, as two dynasties locked in a bitter struggle for control of the Mediterranean's most coveted prize, Sicily. On one side, Charles II of Anjou, the embattled King of Naples, desperate to reclaim the island his father had lost. On the other, the Aragonese fleet, commanded by the shrewd Admiral Roger of Loria, a man who understood the sea like few others. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in how logistics, not just bravery, could win wars. Charles had assembled a formidable force of galleys, their decks packed with Provençal and Italian marines eager to prove their mettle. But Roger of Loria had spent years studying his enemy's weaknesses. He knew Charles's fleet was stretched thin, its supply lines strained by months of campaigning. So instead of meeting the Angevins head-on, Roger played a waiting game. He harried their coastal outposts, cut off their reinforcements, and let hunger and frustration do their work. When the fleets finally clashed near Naples, the Angevins were already on the back foot, their crews exhausted, their morale fraying. The battle itself was a whirlwind of arrows and grappling hooks, with galleys locking together in a deadly embrace. Aragonese crossbowmen, positioned on high forecastles, rained death down on the Angevin decks, while Roger's ships exploited the wind to outmaneuver their heavier opponents. Chaos reigned as boarding parties surged across splintered gangplanks, swords flashing in the midday sun. But the real story wasn't the bloodshed, it was the preparation that made it possible. Roger's fleet had spent months stockpiling supplies, repairing hulls, and drilling crews, while Charles's forces had raced into battle undermanned and undersupplied. Victory at Naples didn't just secure Aragonese rule over Sicily, it reshaped the balance of power in southern Europe. The Angevins, once the dominant force in the region, saw their influence crumble, while Aragon emerged as a Mediterranean powerhouse. Yet what's often overlooked is how this battle revealed the hidden backbone of naval warfare, the unglamorous, relentless work of keeping a fleet fed, armed, and ready. Roger of Loria didn't just win because his men fought harder, he won because they fought smarter. There's a lesson here that echoes far beyond the medieval world. Great battles are often remembered for their flash and fury, but the quiet victories, the ones fought in shipyards and storehouses, are what make the flash possible. The Gulf of Naples proves that supremacy at sea isn't just about who has the most ships, it's about who can keep them sailing, fighting, and surviving long enough to matter. And while this clash might lack the fame of Lepanto or Trafalgar, its legacy is just as profound, a reminder that the tide of history often turns on the smallest, most practical details. The year 1302 marked a turning point in the eastern Mediterranean, where a scrappy young power proved it could punch far above its weight. Near the ancient city of Nicomedia, a fledgling Ottoman fleet faced off against the Byzantine navy, a force that had once ruled these waters unchallenged. What the Byzantines saw as just another skirmish against upstart raiders would become something far more significant, the moment the Ottomans announced their arrival as a naval force to be reckoned with. The Ottomans, led by the shrewd commander Osman Ghazi, didn't have the numbers or the heavy warships of their rivals. What they did have was mobility and audacity. Their fleet consisted of nimble light galleys, vessels built for speed and flexibility rather than brute force. As the Byzantines lumbered forward in their traditional formation, the Ottomans darted between them like wolves harrying a herd, using hit-and-run tactics to disrupt their cohesion. But the real stroke of genius came on land. Ottoman marines, trained for amphibious assaults, swarmed ashore to seize key positions along the coast, turning what should have been a straightforward naval clash into a chaotic, multi-front engagement. The Byzantines, trapped between enemy ships and shore-based archers, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Baphius wasn't just a victory, it was a blueprint. For the first time, the Ottomans demonstrated how a smaller, more agile force could defeat a traditional navy by refusing to fight on its terms. They exploited the Byzantines' reliance on outdated tactics, their hesitation to adapt to an enemy that fought both on water and land. This battle didn't just secure Ottoman control over the Sea of Marmara, it planted the seeds for their future dominance. Within decades, that same formula, light ships, amphibious flexibility, and relentless innovation would carry them to victories across the Mediterranean. Yet what makes Baphius so fascinating isn't just the tactics, but the symbolism. Here was a rising power learning to weaponize its disadvantages, turning its lack of traditional naval strength into a creative advantage. The Byzantines, heirs to centuries of maritime tradition, failed to recognize the shift until it was too late. By the time they grasped the scale of the threat, the Ottomans had already mastered the art of naval warfare on their own terms. History often skips over these early struggles, focusing instead on the Ottomans' later, flashier conquests, but Baphius deserves more than a footnote. It was here, in these forgotten waters, that the Ottoman navy took its first confident steps toward empire, and where the Mediterranean's old order got its first uneasy glimpse of the storm to come. By the winter of 1380, Venice was on the brink of annihilation. The Genoese, their bitter rivals for control of Mediterranean trade, had done the unthinkable. They'd sailed into the very heart of the Venetian lagoon, capturing the strategic port of Chioggia just a stone's throw from Venice itself. For the first time in centuries, the Republic's survival hung by a thread. The city's legendary canals, once bustling with merchants and sailors, now echoed with the grim preparations of a people staring down defeat. But what the Genoese didn't account for was Venetian ingenuity and a bold gamble that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. Under cover of darkness on the 22nd of December, a small flotilla of Venetian galleys slipped through the maze of shallow channels that crisscrossed the lagoon. Their mission was audacious, to sink blockships in the narrow passages around Chioggia, trapping the Genoese fleet inside. It was a plan born of desperation, but it worked with terrifying precision. As the Genoese awoke to find their escape routes choked with wreckage, the Venetians struck from all sides, their archers and crossbowmen raining fire onto the trapped ships. The battle raged for days, a grueling stalemate fought in icy waters until finally, starvation and dwindling supplies forced the Genoese to surrender. What makes Chioggia so extraordinary isn't just the victory, it's the sheer improbability of it all. Venice had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and nearly overrun. Yet through a combination of intimate knowledge of their home waters and ruthless tactical creativity, they turned certain disaster into triumph. The blockade broken, the Genoese threat evaporated almost overnight, and Venice emerged not just intact but stronger than ever. This battle didn't just save a city, it cemented Venetian dominance over the Adriatic for generations to come. Yet there's a deeper lesson in this clash, one that resonates far beyond the medieval world. Chioggia proves that even the most dire situations can be reversed with cleverness and courage. The Venetians didn't win because they had more ships or better weapons. They won because they understood their environment better than their enemies did. They turned the lagoon itself into a weapon, using its shifting tides and hidden channels to outthink a superior force. History often skips over these desperate, gritty struggles in favor of cleaner narratives, but Chioggia deserves to be remembered. It was a battle fought not on the open sea, but in the murky shallows of a homeland under siege. And while the Republic's golden domes and marble palaces might suggest an untouchable grandeur, this clash reminds us that even the mightiest empires are just one misstep away from collapse. and one brilliant maneuver away from survival. The summer of 1217 was a desperate time for England. The kingdom was fractured, torn apart by the First Barons' War, with rebel nobles backed by French forces threatening to overthrow the young King Henry III. Across the Channel, Prince Louis of France had already landed with an army, seizing London and declaring himself the rightful ruler. The situation seemed hopeless until a handful of English ships, led by the tenacious Hubert de Berg, changed everything in the waters off Sandwich. What unfolded that August morning was less a traditional naval battle and more a masterclass in audacity. The French had assembled a formidable reinforcement fleet, their decks packed with knights and supplies destined for Prince Louis. They sailed with confidence, expecting little resistance from England's battered navy, but de Berg, the castle constable of Dover, wasn't playing by their rules. Instead of meeting the French head-on, he used the narrow channels and shifting sandbars of the Kentish coast to his advantage. His smaller, more maneuverable ships ambushed the French as they struggled with the tides, their heavy vessels bogged down in shallow waters. The chaos was absolute. English sailors, many of them hardened by years of coastal warfare, swarmed the French flagship, grappling onto its decks with hooks and ropes. The French commander, Eustace the Monk, a notorious mercenary who had once terrorized these same waters as a pirate, found himself cornered. The battle turned into a brutal melee with axes and swords flashing in the sunlight. When the dust settled, Eustace was dead, his head mounted on a pike as a grim warning, and the French fleet was in disarray. Without reinforcements, Prince Louis's campaign in England began to unravel. Sandwich wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological earthquake. The French had assumed England was on its knees, but de Berg's raid proved otherwise. It bought Henry III crucial time, allowing loyalist forces to regroup and eventually force Louis to the negotiating table. Yet for all its importance, this battle remains overshadowed by the more famous clashes of English history: Hastings, Agincourt, Trafalgar. What makes Sandwich so remarkable isn't just the scale of the fight, but the sheer unpredictability of its outcome. Here was a battle won not by superior numbers or advanced technology, but by local knowledge, sheer nerve, and a willingness to take impossible risks. De Berg understood something his enemies didn't. In naval warfare, sometimes the boldest move is the only one that can turn the tide. And while history might remember Sandwich as a footnote, its legacy is undeniable. It was proof that even in England's darkest hour, the sea could be its greatest ally, a lesson that would echo through centuries of naval conflicts to come. The Adriatic Sea in 1298 was a powder keg waiting to explode. For decades, Venice and Genoa had been locked in a brutal dance of dominance, their merchant empires colliding from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. But at Kuzola, a rocky island off the Dalmatian coast, that rivalry reached its bloody crescendo. The Genoese, still smarting from past defeats, had set a trap, and the unsuspecting Venetian fleet sailed straight into it. What made this clash different wasn't just the scale of the slaughter, but the stakes. Venice had sent its finest, over 90 galleys, their decks crowded with seasoned mariners and noble commanders. Among them, according to some chronicles, was none other than Marco Polo, freshly returned from his travels in the East. But the Genoese, led by the cunning Loria, had spent months studying Venetian tactics. They lured their enemies into shallow waters, where the larger Venetian ships struggled to maneuver, then struck with relentless precision. The battle raged for hours, a swirling chaos of grappling hooks and flaming arrows, until the Adriatic turned crimson with the blood of thousands. Kuzola wasn't just a victory for Genoa, it was a humiliation for Venice. The capture of Marco Polo, if the stories are true, added a layer of symbolic insult to the defeat. Yet the real shockwave came in the aftermath. With their fleet shattered, Venice was forced to sue for peace, ceding trade privileges and territory to their rivals. For a brief, dizzying moment, Genoa stood unchallenged as the Mediterranean's premier maritime power. But history has a way of balancing the scales. While Kuzola was a tactical masterpiece, it failed to deliver a knockout blow. Venice, though battered, rebuilt with astonishing speed, its merchant networks too vast to collapse overnight. Within years, the Republic was back on the offensive, proving that empires built on salt and silk don't fall easily. What makes this battle so fascinating isn't just the clash of ships, but the clash of philosophies. Genoa fought like a wolf, fierce, opportunistic, ruthless. Venice moved like water, adapting, flowing, enduring. Kuzola was Genoa's revenge, but it was also a reminder. In the game of maritime empires, no victory is ever final. The tides always turn, and sometimes the battles forgotten by history are the ones that teach us the most about resilience. The Strait of Gibraltar in 1309 was more than a gateway between seas. It was a proving ground for the future of warfare. As Castilian forces tightened their siege around the last Moorish stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, they didn't just rely on brute force or numbers. They brought something new to the fight, the thunderous roar of shipboard cannons. These weren't the refined artillery pieces of later centuries, but crude, experimental weapons that belched smoke and iron, shaking both the walls of Gibraltar and the very foundations of naval combat. For weeks, Castilian galleys prowled the strait, their decks bristling with these early cannon prototypes. The goal wasn't just to bombard the city, it was to test whether firepower could replace sheer manpower in breaking a siege. The results were messy but revolutionary. While the cannons lacked precision, their psychological impact was undeniable. Moorish defenders, accustomed to weathering arrows and catapults, now faced an unseen terror. Projectiles that struck without warning, shattering stone and morale alike. What makes this siege so pivotal isn't just the technology, but the timing. Europe was on the cusp of a military revolution, and Gibraltar offered a glimpse of what was coming. Traditional naval tactics still revolved around boarding actions and ramming, but here, for the first time, ships became floating platforms for artillery. The Castilians didn't just win a battle, they stumbled onto a formula that would dominate warfare for centuries. Yet there's a cruel irony in this forgotten milestone. While Gibraltar would later become synonymous with epic naval clashes, this early siege faded into obscurity. The cannons of 1309 were too primitive, too unreliable to capture the imagination of chroniclers. But their legacy lingered. Within decades, every major power in the Mediterranean was scrambling to mount guns on their ships, igniting an arms race that would reshape empires. The lesson of Gibraltar isn't just about firepower, it's about adaptation. The Castilians didn't wait for perfect weapons. They used what they had, pushing the boundaries of the possible. And in doing so, they proved that the future of war doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it creeps in with a whisper of smoke across forgotten waters, waiting for history to catch up. The waters off the Oinouses Islands in 1090 were deceptively calm as Emperor Alexios Komnenos faced a nightmare scenario, a rogue Norman fleet, battle-hardened and hungry for plunder, bearing down on the heart of his empire. These weren't just ordinary raiders, they were the remnants of the infamous Guiscard dynasty, a family that had already sacked Byzantine cities and now threatened Constantinople itself. The Normans had a reputation for audacity, but Alexios had something they didn't expect: a fleet meticulously rebuilt after years of neglect, and a strategy that would turn their aggression against them. As the Norman ships closed in, the Byzantines executed a maneuver so precise it seemed choreographed. Instead of meeting the invaders head-on, Alexios's admiral, Nictus Castamonites, lured them into shallow waters where their heavier vessels floundered. Then, with a signal from lanterns, the Byzantine galleys pivoted in unison, unleashing a storm of Greek fire onto the trapped Normans. The effect was catastrophic. Flames raced across decks, swallowing ships whole, while panicked crews leaped into the sea to escape the inferno. Within hours, the once proud Norman fleet was reduced to charred wreckage, their dreams of conquest sinking beneath the waves. This victory wasn't just a tactical masterstroke, it was a fleeting glimpse of Byzantium's former glory. Alexios had inherited a navy in shambles, its once mighty squadrons rotting in harbor. His triumph at Oinouses proved that with leadership and innovation, even a fading empire could strike back. Yet the bittersweet truth lingered: this would be Byzantium's last great naval victory. Within a century, their fleet would dwindle to a shadow of its former self, leaving the empire defenseless against the Crusaders who would sack Constantinople in 1204, and the Ottomans who would ultimately deliver the death blow. What makes Oinouses so haunting isn't the battle itself, but the irony that followed. Alexios's victory bought time, but not transformation. The Byzantines, burdened by bureaucracy and endless land wars, let their naval advantage slip away, forgetting the lesson Oinouses should have seared into memory. Mastery of the sea wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. The Normans had been crushed, but the empire's real enemy was complacency, and so this forgotten clash stands as a quiet epitaph for Byzantine sea power. A moment when the empire proved it could still defend its shores, but lacked the will to sustain that strength. The flames that consumed the Norman fleet were a brilliant last flicker, not the dawn of renewal, but the sunset of an era. The summer of 1278 should have been Castile's crowning moment, a bold strike across the Strait of Gibraltar to carry the Reconquista into the heart of Muslim North Africa. King Alfonso X, known as the Wise, had spent years assembling an invasion force unlike anything Iberia had seen. Over 100 ships crewed by Castilian knights, Genoese mercenaries, and crusading volunteers. Their target was Algeciras, the Marinid Sultanate's key port and a gateway to Morocco. But ambition, as Alfonso would learn, is no match for ingenuity or fire. The Marinids, led by Sultan Abu Yusuf Yaqub, had no intention of meeting the Castilians head-on. Instead, they turned the sea itself into a weapon. As the invasion fleet anchored near Algeciras, the night erupted in flames. Marinid sailors had loaded small, fast boats with oil, pitch, and bundles of dry reeds, setting them ablaze and steering them into the packed Christian ships. The effect was apocalyptic. Fire leaped from hull to hull, fanned by the summer winds, while panicked crews abandoned ship only to drown under the weight of their armor. The Castilian armada, painstakingly built over years, was reduced to charred wreckage in a single night. What makes Algeciras so jarring isn't just the scale of the disaster, it's the ripple effects that followed. The defeat didn't just end Alfonso's North African ambitions, it shattered Castile's naval power for a generation. With their fleet gone, the Christians lost control of the strait, allowing the Marinids to reinforce their allies in Granada and prolong the Reconquista by decades. The battle also exposed a grim truth. Even the most meticulously planned campaigns could unravel in moments when faced with unconventional tactics. The Marinids didn't outfight the Castilians, they outthought them. Yet for all its significance, Algeciras remains oddly absent from broader medieval military history. Perhaps it's the discomfort of examining failure, or the tendency to focus on the Reconquista's eventual triumph. But this clash deserves more than obscurity. It was a brutal lesson in the limits of power, a reminder that the sea rewards humility as much as courage. Alfonso, for all his wisdom, had underestimated the risks of projecting force across continents, a mistake empires would repeat for centuries to come. The legacy of Algeciras lingers not in grand monuments or stirring ballads, but in the quiet recognition that history's turning points aren't always victories. Sometimes they're the disasters that force kingdoms and kings to rethink everything, and while the flames of 1278 have long since cooled, their lesson still burns. The difference between ambition and overreach is often just the width of a strait and the spark of a single fire ship. The moonlit waters off Malta in 1283 hid a fleet in motion, Aragonese galleys gliding silently toward their sleeping prey. The Angevin navy, confident after years of dominating Sicilian waters, had anchored for the night, their flagship towering above the rest like a floating fortress. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a lightning strike that would decide the fate of an island kingdom. Roger of Loria, Aragon's brilliant admiral, had spent months studying his enemies' routines. He knew their watch rotations, their anchor points, even the arrogance that left them vulnerable. Under cover of darkness, his crews muffled their oars with cloth, creeping close enough to smell the Angevin cookfires before the first alarm sounded. Chaos erupted as Aragonese boarding parties swarmed the flagship, their daggers flashing in the torchlight. The Angevins, stumbling from their hammocks half asleep, never stood a chance. By dawn, their admiral was in chains, his vessel now flying Aragon's colors, a humiliation that sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was psychological warfare. The sight of their mighty flagship captured intact, shattered Angevin morale, leaving their remaining fleets paralyzed with indecision. Within months, Sicily slipped irrevocably from their grasp, becoming the crown jewel of Aragon's growing empire. What makes this Malta clash so fascinating isn't just the audacity of the raid, it's the long shadow it cast. For centuries, Sicily had been the prize in a tug of war between popes, emperors, and kings. Now, with one bold stroke, Roger of Loria had yanked the rope decisively toward Aragon, reshaping the balance of power in southern Europe. Yet, unlike the legendary Siege of Malta in 1565, this earlier battle faded into obscurity, overshadowed by the epic land battles of the age. Perhaps it's because night actions leave fewer chroniclers, no grand vistas for painters, no sunlit heroics for poets, but the real lesson of Malta 1283 is subtler. Sometimes the quietest battles echo the loudest through history. Roger didn't just win a fight, he proved that naval supremacy could be seized not through brute force, but through patience, preparation, and the element of surprise. And while the Great Siege of Malta would later capture imaginations with its scale and drama, this forgotten midnight duel set the stage, proving that the Mediterranean's fate could turn on a single, perfectly executed gamble in the dark. The waters off Ponza in the summer of 1300 seemed calm, too calm. The Angevin fleet, sent by Charles II of Naples to crush the rebellious Sicilians, moved with the arrogance of overwhelming force. Their galleys outnumbered the enemy nearly 2-1, their decks packed with seasoned knights and Genoese mercenaries. But the Sicilians, led by the cunning admiral Roger of Loria, weren't planning to meet them head-on. Instead, they turned the Tyrrhenian Sea's jagged coastline into a weapon. As the Angevins rounded the island's northern cliffs, they found their formations shattered by hidden currents and sudden winds, natural traps Roger had studied for years. Then, from the coves and inlets, Sicilian galleys surged like wolves from an ambush, their oars churning the sea to foam. The Angevin commanders, trained for pitched battles in open water, panicked as their fleet was splintered into isolated pockets. Roger's ships struck with surgical precision, ramming stragglers and boarding flagship after flagship. Within hours, the sea was littered with broken hulls and the remnants of Charles's shattered ambitions. What makes Ponza so startling isn't just the scale of the defeat, it's the revelation that medieval naval warfare wasn't always about brute strength. Roger's victory hinged on intimate knowledge of the environment, psychological warfare, and the ability to turn an enemy's confidence into their greatest weakness. The Angevins had sailed expecting a straightforward brawl. What they got was a masterclass in asymmetrical combat, yet the battle's aftermath is just as revealing. The Sicilians, though outnumbered, captured so many noble prisoners that the ransom money funded their rebellion for years. Meanwhile, the Angevins, humiliated and financially drained, never fully recovered their naval dominance. Ponza proved that in medieval warfare, a single clever admiral could outweigh a dozen well-armed fleets, and that the sea, far from being a neutral battlefield, was a living ally for those who learned to read its secrets. This forgotten clash deserves more than a footnote. It's a reminder that history's most decisive battles aren't always the largest or loudest. Sometimes they're the ones where cunning meets opportunity in the right stretch of water, and where the tide of an entire war turns on a moment of perfect, ruthless calculation. The winter of 1342 brought a storm of sails and swords to the coast of Brittany, where the English and French navies collided in a battle that would shape the course of the 100 Years' War. Brest, a bustling port town, had become a flashpoint in the struggle for control of the English Channel, a lifeline for troops, supplies, and communication between England and its continental holdings. The French, determined to sever this vital artery, had massed a formidable fleet of galleys and cogs, their decks bristling with crossbowmen and men-at-arms. But the English, though outnumbered, had a weapon the French couldn't match: the deadly precision of their longbowmen, seasoned by years of coastal raids and channel skirmishes. As the two fleets closed in near Brest's rocky shoreline, the English admiral, Robert Morley, made a calculated gamble. Instead of engaging in a traditional boarding action, he ordered his ships to hold formation just beyond the range of French crossbows. Then, with the wind at their backs, the English unleashed a relentless hail of arrows, a storm of wood and iron that darkened the sky. The French, packed tightly on their decks, had no defense against the onslaught. Men fell like wheat before a scythe, their armor no match for the longbow's piercing power. Panic spread as the French captains, realizing their disadvantage, tried to close the distance, only to find the English ships slipping away, always just out of reach. What makes Brest so pivotal isn't just the tactics, but the timing. This battle occurred a full 4 years before the more famous clash at Sluys, yet it previewed the same devastating formula. English archery combined with disciplined ship handling could outmaneuver and outfight even the largest continental fleets. The victory at Brest didn't just secure the Channel for England, it planted the seeds of a naval doctrine that would dominate the war's early years. Yet for all its significance, Brest remains overshadowed by the larger, bloodier battles that followed. Perhaps it's because the engagement lacked the grand spectacle of Sluys, or because it was fought in the shadow of land campaigns that captured more attention. But the real lesson of Brest is subtler. Dominance at sea isn't always about the biggest fleet or the boldest charge. Sometimes it's about the quiet mastery of range, wind, and psychology, the understanding that a battle can be won before the first grappling hook is thrown. The French left Brest that day with a bitter realization. The Channel wasn't just a strip of water to be crossed, but a fortress to be conquered. And while history might remember Sluys as the defining naval moment of the 100 Years' War, it was here, in these less celebrated waters, that the English first proved they could turn the sea into their greatest ally. The summer of 1372 brought flames to the shores of La Rochelle, where an English fleet learned the hard way that mastery of the Channel didn't mean invincibility at sea. The Hundred Years' War had long been defined by English triumphs on land, Crécy, Poitiers, the longbow's dominance. But here, off the coast of western France, the rules of engagement were about to be rewritten. The English had sent a convoy of reinforcements, packed with troops and supplies meant to shore up their crumbling positions in Aquitaine. What they hadn't accounted for was the ingenuity of the Castilian admiral, Ambrosio Boccanegra, and his ruthless understanding of fire's power on water. As the English ships lumbered into the Bay of La Rochelle, they found themselves cornered not by superior numbers but by audacity. Boccanegra's fleet, though smaller, had spent days preparing a nightmare scenario: old vessels packed with pitch, tar, and dry timber, their decks rigged to ignite at the pull of a rope. Under cover of darkness, these fire ships were set adrift among the anchored English fleet, their sails billowing with unnatural light. Panic spread faster than the flames. Sailors trained to fight men, not elements, scrambled to cut anchors and flee, only to collide with each other in the chaos. The Castilian galleys, waiting just beyond the Inferno, picked off the stragglers with merciless precision. By dawn, the bay was a graveyard of smoldering hulls and drowned ambitions. This wasn't just a tactical defeat for England, it was a strategic earthquake. The loss of La Rochelle severed their lifeline to Gascony, leaving garrisons isolated and rebellions unchecked. For Castile, the victory was a rare moment of naval glory, proving that even a land power could outmaneuver the masters of the Channel with the right tactics. Yet what's often overlooked is the psychological blow. The English, so used to controlling the narrative of the war, suddenly faced an enemy who fought on their terms, not with arrows, but with ash and smoke. The battle's obscurity is almost poetic. While Agincourt and Poitiers became legend, La Rochelle faded into the margins, as if history couldn't reconcile an English naval defeat with the story it preferred to tell. But the lesson lingers. Warfare at sea follows no script. A kingdom built on longbows could still burn when the wind turned against it. And sometimes, the battles forgotten by the victors are the ones that teach the sharpest lessons about the fragility of power. The Ionian Sea in 1403 was a chessboard where empires moved their fleets like pieces, each maneuver carrying the weight of centuries to come. Venice, the aging queen of the Adriatic, faced a rising power that threatened to sweep her from the board: the Ottomans, whose galleys grew bolder with each passing season. When the two forces met near Modon, a Venetian stronghold in the Peloponnese, it wasn't just a battle for control of a harbor. It was a test of whether experience could still outmatch ambition on the open water. What made Modon extraordinary was the sheer audacity of the Venetian strategy. Outnumbered and outgunned, their admiral, Carlo Zeno, didn't wait for the Ottomans to strike. He took the fight to them, exploiting a flaw in their formation, a gap between their heavier warships and lighter support vessels. With the wind at his back, Zeno drove his galleys straight into that gap, splitting the Ottoman fleet in two. The resulting chaos was a masterclass in naval improvisation. Venetian marines, trained for close-quarters combat, swarmed the isolated Ottoman ships, while their crossbowmen picked off enemy crews from the high forecastles. By midday, the Ottomans were in full retreat, their dreams of pushing into the Adriatic temporarily dashed. This victory wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. For decades, the Ottomans had seemed unstoppable, their navy growing stronger with every campaign. Yet at Modon, Venice proved they could still be outmaneuvered, their momentum disrupted by a well-timed strike. The battle bought the Republic precious time, delaying Ottoman advances long enough to fortify their remaining outposts. But the bittersweet truth lingered: Modon was less a turning point than a stay of execution. Within a generation, the Ottomans would return, their fleets larger and their strategies refined. What's often overlooked is how Modon revealed the changing nature of Mediterranean warfare. This wasn't a clash of brute force, but of logistics and coordination. Zeno's victory hinged on his crew's ability to execute complex maneuvers under pressure, a skill honed through Venice's mercantile tradition, where efficiency meant profit as much as survival. The Ottomans, though fierce, still relied on sheer numbers and individual courage. Modon showed that in galley warfare, discipline could trump sheer might, at least for a time. Yet history has a way of forgetting these nuanced struggles. Modon lacks the drama of Lepanto or the scale of Constantinople's sieges, so it slips through the cracks of popular memory. But its legacy is undeniable. For a fleeting moment, Venice demonstrated that even an aging empire could teach its rivals a lesson that the sea rewards not just power but precision. And while the tide of Ottoman expansion would eventually prove unstoppable, Modon remains a testament to the art of naval warfare at its most elegant, a dance of wood, wind, and willpower on the waves. The waters off the Echinades Islands in 1427 shimmered with a fleeting brilliance, the last spark of Byzantine naval mastery before the flame was snuffed out forever. Emperor John VIII, desperate to prove his crumbling empire still had teeth, had scraped together every seaworthy vessel left in Constantinople's rotting harbors. Against them sailed an Ottoman fleet, confident and battle-hardened, eager to erase the last traces of Byzantine resistance in the Aegean. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a ghost's final, defiant shout across the centuries. The Byzantines, led by the resourceful commander Laokas Notaras, played their only remaining card perfectly, luring the Ottomans into the narrow channels between the rocky Echinades islets. They turned the confined waters into a killing zone. With the wind in their favor, Byzantine galleys rammed into the Ottoman vanguard, their marines boarding enemy ships with the desperation of men who knew this might be their last fight. Greek fire, that legendary, terrifying weapon, made a brief reappearance, its flames licking across Ottoman sails as panic spread through their ranks. By sunset, the sea was littered with broken hulls, and the Ottomans were in retreat. For the first time in decades, Byzantine banners flew victorious over the waves, yet the bitter irony of Echinades lingers in its aftermath. This triumph, so hard-won, changed nothing. The Byzantines lacked the ships, the men, and the gold to capitalize on their victory. Within 2 decades, Constantinople's walls would crack under Ottoman cannon fire, its harbors empty of the fleet that had once ruled the Mediterranean. Laokas Notaras himself would perish in the city's final hours, his naval triumph at Echinades reduced to a forgotten footnote. What makes this battle so haunting isn't the tactics or the carnage, it's the symbolism. Echinades was Byzantium's naval swan song, a fleeting reminder of what the empire had been at its height. Those flames that consumed Ottoman ships were the last flicker of a dying flame, a final proof that even in its twilight, Byzantium could still summon echoes of its former might. But history offers no points for bravery alone. The empire that had once dominated 3 continents with its fleets now clung to survival by a thread, its victories as ephemeral as sea foam. The lesson of Echinades cuts deeper than most medieval battles. It's a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how glorious its past, can survive on nostalgia alone. The Byzantines won the day but lost the future, their momentary triumph swallowed by the relentless tide of time. And while the fall of Constantinople would echo through history, this quiet battle among the Greek islands remains a poignant epitaph, a last, lonely testament to what happens when the sea forgets an empire's name. The waters off Cape St. Vincent in 1476 were more than just a battleground, they were the proving ground for empires. On one side, Portugal, its ships laden with spices and gold from African voyages. determined to protect its hard-won monopoly on Atlantic trade. On the other, Castile, hungry for a share of the riches, sent its own fleet to challenge Portuguese dominance. Among the chaos of clashing hulls and snapping sails stood a young Genoa sailor named Christopher Columbus, years away from his infamous voyage west, fighting for the Portuguese crown. It's a twist of history that this forgotten battle, not his later exploits, might have first sharpened his understanding of the sea's brutal realities. The engagement itself was a messy, sprawling affair typical of medieval naval warfare. Without clear lines or formations, ships grappled in close combat, their crews locked in desperate struggles on swaying decks. Portuguese caravels, sleek and fast, darted between heavier Castilian vessels, their crossbowmen picking off enemy sailors with lethal precision. But what makes Cape St. Vincent truly significant isn't the bloodshed, it's the stakes. This wasn't just about territory, it was about who would control the gateway to the Atlantic, and by extension, the future of global exploration. Portugal's victory here cemented its dominance over African trade routes, forcing Castile to look elsewhere for opportunities, a pressure that would eventually push Columbus toward his fateful idea of sailing west. Yet for all its importance, this battle remains a footnote in history, overshadowed by the legend of Columbus' later voyages. That's the irony. The very conflict that may have shaped his maritime instincts is now eclipsed by the myth of the man himself. What Cape St. Vincent teaches us is how messy, brutal naval clashes quietly set the stage for the so-called Age of Discovery. Empires weren't built on bold ideas alone. They were forged in battles like this, where control of a single stretch of water could redirect the course of history. The deeper lesson lies in the unintended consequences. Portugal's triumph at sea didn't just secure trade routes. It indirectly spurred Castile's desperation to find new paths, accelerating the rush toward uncharted oceans. Columbus, who survived this battle, carried its lessons with him: the unpredictability of the sea, the ruthlessness of naval warfare, the high cost of ambition. And while history remembers him for crossing the Atlantic, it was here, in this overlooked clash, that the currents of exploration began to shift in ways no one could have predicted. Perhaps that's why Cape St. Vincent deserves more than obscurity. It's a reminder that the grand narratives of history often hinge on forgotten struggles, where the real turning points aren't always the ones we celebrate. The sea doesn't care about fame. It only remembers who dared to master it, even for a moment. And sometimes the battles that slip through the cracks are the ones that change the world. The waters around the Lipari Islands in 1268 were anything but tranquil. They became the stage for one of the most vicious galley duels of the medieval Mediterranean. The Angevins, backed by French gold and papal favor, had thrown their full weight into crushing Aragonese ambitions in Sicily. Their fleet, a mix of heavy Provençal galleys and nimble Ligurian warships, outnumbered the Aragonese almost 2-1. But numbers alone don't win battles at sea. What unfolded was a lesson in how desperation and discipline could overturn even the bleakest odds. Roger of Loria, the Aragonese admiral, knew his enemy's weakness: overconfidence. The Angevins, accustomed to bullying smaller fleets, sailed straight into the rocky channels north of Sicily, their formation tight but predictable. Loria's galleys, lighter and faster, feigned retreat, luring the Angevin vanguard into a bottleneck where their numbers meant nothing. Then, with a signal from flags, the Aragonese turned like a school of fish, their rams slamming into the exposed flanks of the lead Angevin ships. The battle dissolved into 100 separate brawls, decks slick with blood, grappling hooks biting into wood, men fighting hand to hand with axes and daggers. What made Lipari so decisive wasn't just the carnage, but the aftermath. The Angevins lost not just ships, but commanders, nobles who had been the backbone of their Sicilian campaign. Their surviving vessels limped back to Naples, their morale shattered. For Aragon, the victory was a turning point. Sicily, once a contested prize, became firmly Aragonese, its ports now launching pads for further expansion into the Mediterranean. Yet the battle's brutality left scars. Chroniclers wrote of bodies washing ashore for weeks, the tides carrying the cost of ambition to every nearby coast. The irony, Lipari's obscurity today stems from its very decisiveness. Most medieval naval battles were messy, inconclusive affairs. Fleets clashed, then disengaged, leaving historians to debate who really won. But Lipari was so clearly a knockout blow that it faded from memory, overshadowed by the political consequences it created. The Aragonese didn't need to keep talking about it. Their control of Sicily spoke for itself. There's a deeper lesson here about naval power in the medieval world. Battles like Lipari weren't just about sinking ships, they were about breaking wills. The Angevins didn't just lose galleys that day, they lost the belief they could ever dominate these waters. And while history books might rush past this clash to focus on treaties and truces, the truth is simpler. Sometimes the fate of kingdoms hinges on who fights smarter in a single afternoon on the waves. The Lipari Islands proved that even the mightiest fleets could be undone by a commander who understood the sea's cruel arithmetic, where position and timing matter more than raw strength. The island of Rhodes in 1480 was a fortress unlike any other, a speck of land transformed into an unbreakable shield against the Ottoman tide. The Knights Hospitaller, those warrior monks who had survived the fall of Acre 2 centuries earlier, had turned Rhodes into the Mediterranean's most formidable naval bulwark. When the Ottoman fleet arrived that summer, their sails darkening the horizon, it wasn't just another siege, it was the first true test of whether gunpowder and stone could defy the might of an empire. What made Rhodes so extraordinary was the knights' ingenuity. While most medieval navies still relied on galleys and grappling hooks, the Hospitallers had spent years fortifying their harbors with artillery batteries, their walls bristling with cannons that could strike ships long before they reached shore. As the Ottoman galleys closed in, they were met with thunder iron shot tearing through hulls, splinters shredding oarsmen, the very air thick with smoke and panic. The Ottomans, accustomed to overwhelming coastal defenses through sheer numbers, found themselves outgunned for the first time in living memory, but the real drama unfolded at sea. The knights didn't just sit behind their walls, they launched their own galleys, lighter and faster than the Ottoman heavies, harrying the enemy's flanks like wolves separating a herd. One bold sortie, led by the French knight Pierre d'Aubusson, even managed to board and capture an Ottoman flagship, a humiliation that sent shockwaves through the besieging fleet. For weeks, the Ottomans threw themselves at Rhodes' defenses, only to be repelled time and again by a combination of firepower and ferocity. The battle's aftermath was as revealing as the fight itself. The Ottomans, though bloodied, learned a brutal lesson. Traditional naval tactics were no match for fortified artillery. They would spend the next decades refining their own siegecraft, eventually returning in 1522 to finish what they started. But Rhodes 1480 deserves its own place in history. This was the moment naval warfare began its slow pivot from melee to firepower, from boarding actions to bombardments. The knights, though they couldn't know it, had glimpsed the future, one where castles of stone would give way to castles of iron, and where the roar of cannons would drown out the clash of swords. Yet for all its significance, this battle is often overshadowed by Suleiman's later victory. Perhaps it's because history prefers clean endings, not defiant stands that merely delay the inevitable. But Rhodes 1480 wasn't just a prelude, it was proof that even against impossible odds, a handful of determined warriors could rewrite the rules of war. And while the island would eventually fall, the echoes of that first defense still resonate wherever ingenuity stares down brute force and refuses to blink. The summer of 1299 brought a storm of sails and ambition to the waters near Cape Orlando, where two navies and two visions for Sicily's future collided in a battle that would decide the island's fate. The War of the Sicilian Vespers had raged for nearly 20 years, a bloody tug of war between the Angevins of Naples, backed by the Pope, and the Aragonese, who had thrown their support behind Sicilian rebels fighting for independence. By the time the fleets met off Sicily's northern coast, the conflict had become more than a territorial dispute. It was a test of whether a small, determined force could outmaneuver an empire. The Angevins, led by the seasoned Admiral Roger de Loria, ironically a former Aragonese commander who had switched sides, held every advantage on paper. Their fleet was larger, their ships heavier, their crews bolstered by Neapolitan veterans, but the Aragonese, under the command of the daring Conrad Doria, had something the Angevins underestimated: intimate knowledge of Sicily's treacherous currents and a willingness to gamble everything on a single, audacious strike. As the Angevin galleys formed up for a traditional frontal assault, Doria's ships suddenly pivoted, using the morning wind to swing around the enemy's flank. The maneuver caught the Angevins off guard, their formation thrown into chaos as the Aragonese rained down arrows and grappling hooks onto their exposed sides. What unfolded next was a masterclass in naval improvisation. The battle dissolved into a series of brutal ship-to-ship duels, decks slick with blood and seawater, as both sides fought with the desperation of men who knew this clash would decide the war. The turning point came when Doria's flagship rammed straight into de Loria's vessel, the two admirals locking swords in a personal duel that mirrored the larger struggle. Though the details are lost to time, chroniclers agree it was Doria who emerged victorious, his men swarming the Angevin decks as their morale crumbled. By midday, the sea was littered with shattered hulls, and the remnants of the Angevin fleet were in full retreat. Cape Orlando's true significance lies not in the carnage, but in the peace it forced. With their navy broken, the Angevins had no choice but to accept Sicily's independence, ending decades of bloodshed and securing Aragonese influence in the central Mediterranean for generations. Yet for all its impact, this battle remains oddly absent from popular histories, overshadowed by the land campaigns of the Vespers War. Perhaps it's because naval clashes leave fewer ruins to inspire poets, or because their outcomes feel more abstract than the fall of a castle. But the lesson of Cape Orlando is undeniable. Sometimes the most decisive battles aren't fought on the fields we remember, but on the waves we forget. The irony is rich. Roger de Loria, the very admiral who had once led Aragonese fleets to victory, found himself outmaneuvered by his former comrades, a reminder that in medieval warfare, loyalty was as fluid as the tides. And while the Aragonese celebrated, their triumph carried a bittersweet edge. Victory at sea had secured Sicily's freedom, but it also entrenched the island's role as a pawn in larger imperial games. The battle's legacy, then, isn't just one of tactics or heroics, but of the quiet truth that independence often comes with invisible chains. What makes Cape Orlando worth remembering isn't just the clash of wood and steel, but the way it encapsulates the messy, human drama of medieval conflict. This wasn't a clean, glorious showdown. It was a gritty, chaotic struggle where the fate of thousands hinged on the decisions of a handful of men in a single afternoon. And while history might overlook it in favor of flashier battles, the echoes of that day still ripple through time, a reminder that the sea, for all its vastness, has a way of amplifying even the smallest acts of courage or folly. The Dalmatian coast in 1358 was supposed to be Venetian territory, a string of fortified ports and islands the Republic had controlled for centuries. But Hungary's ambitious king Louis I had other plans. Determined to challenge Venice's stranglehold on Adriatic trade, he'd assembled something unheard of, a Hungarian navy. On paper, it was a laughable mismatch. Venice, the undisputed queen of the Mediterranean, with centuries of naval tradition, against a landlocked kingdom's hastily built fleet. Yet what unfolded in those rocky coastal waters wasn't just a battle. It was a stark reminder that even maritime giants can be shaken when newcomers refuse to play by the old rules. Hungary's strategy was as bold as it was unorthodox. Instead of meeting Venice's galleys in open water, where their seasoned crews held every advantage, King Louis's admiral, Miklos Toldi, lured them into the maze of islands and narrow channels along the Dalmatian shoreline. Here, the Venetians' famed discipline worked against them. Their tight formations, so effective in the open sea, became liabilities in confined spaces, where Hungarian ships smaller, lighter, and more nimble darted between them like hornets. Toldi's men, many of them river sailors accustomed to navigating the Danube's treacherous currents, exploited every cove and blind turn, ambushing Venetian stragglers with ruthless efficiency. The turning point came near the island of Pag, where the Venetians, frustrated and disoriented, made a fatal error. Their admiral, Giovanni Dandolo, ordered a full charge into what he thought was the Hungarian vanguard, only to find himself encircled by hidden reinforcements emerging from coastal fog. The battle dissolved into chaos, with Venetian galleys ramming each other in the confusion while Hungarian archers rained fire from the cliffs above. By nightfall, Dandolo's flagship was captured, its proud lion banner dragged through the surf by cheering Hungarian sailors. Yet history has a way of smoothing over inconvenient truths. Despite the humiliation, Venice ultimately prevailed in the larger war, leveraging its deeper pockets and diplomatic muscle to wear Hungary down. The Treaty of Zara that followed returned Dalmatia to Venetian control, consigning the clash to a footnote in the Republic's glorious chronicles. But the battle's real legacy lies in what it revealed. Even the mightiest naval powers are vulnerable when forced to fight on unfamiliar terms. Hungary, with no maritime tradition to speak of, had exposed the fragility of Venice's dominance, not through superior strength, but through sheer audacity and adaptability. What makes this forgotten skirmish so fascinating isn't the outcome, but the symbolism. For a fleeting moment, the Adriatic's established order trembled. The Hungarians, though outmatched in every conventional sense, proved that the sea rewards creativity as much as tradition. And while Venice would go on to rule these waters for centuries more, the lesson of 1358 lingered like salt in the wind. No empire, no matter how ancient, can afford to assume its dominance is eternal. The Dalmatian coast was a wake-up call, one that echoes whenever an underdog refuses to accept the rules of the game. These forgotten battles weren't just brief flashes of violence on the open water. They were turning points that quietly shaped the world we live in today. Think about it. Every time you trace a shipping route on a map, every time you admire the skyline of a coastal city built on centuries of trade, you're seeing the indirect legacy of these clashes. The medieval Mediterranean wasn't just a battleground. It was the internet of its day, a network of routes and ports where wealth, ideas, and power flowed. And the empires that controlled these waterways didn't just win battles, they dictated the rhythm of history itself. Take Greek fire, that terrifying Byzantine weapon that turned the tide at Constantinople in 717. Its invention didn't just save an empire, It sparked an arms race that stretched across centuries. Rulers from Venice to Damascus scrambled to replicate or counter it, pouring resources into naval technology in ways that accelerated ship design, metallurgy, and even early chemistry. The same goes for the early cannons tested at Gibraltar in 1309. What began as crude, experimental weapons mounted on Castilian ships would evolve into the artillery that defined naval warfare for the next 500 years. These battles weren't just fights, they were live fire laboratories where the future was forged in smoke and salt water. But the impact wasn't just technological. These clashes redrew the map in ways we still feel today. When Roger of Loria crushed the Angevin fleet at Naples in 1287, he didn't just secure Sicily for Aragon. He shifted the center of Mediterranean power, ensuring Spanish influence would dominate southern Italy for generations. Likewise, Venice's desperate victory at Chioggia in 1380 didn't just save the Republic. It preserved the Adriatic as a Venetian lake, shaping trade patterns that would fuel the Renaissance. The ripple effects are staggering. No Venetian naval dominance might mean no Venetian-funded art, no Medici banking empire, no explosion of creativity that defined early modern Europe. And let's not forget the human cost. These battles were more than tactical diagrams in history books. They were moments of unimaginable courage and suffering. Picture the Hungarian river sailors who outmaneuvered Venice's elite fleet in 1358, or the English longbowmen who turned the tide at Brest in 1342. Their stories remind us that naval warfare wasn't just about ships. It was about the people who crewed them, the communities that relied on them, and the cultures that rose or fell because of them. When we overlook these battles, we don't just miss military history, we miss the beating heart of the medieval world. So why does this matter now? Because history isn't a collection of isolated events, it's a web of cause and effect. The Ottomans' painful lesson at Modon in 1403 taught them how to adapt, paving the way for their later dominance. The Genoa's triumph at Kuzola in 1298 didn't just humiliate Venice, it accelerated the rivalry that would push both cities to explore new trade routes, indirectly fueling the Age of Discovery. Even failures like Alfonso the Wise's disaster at Algeciras in 1278 had consequences, forcing Castile to rethink its strategy and ultimately look westward, a decision that would lead to Columbus and the reshaping of the globe. The real tragedy isn't that these battles are forgotten, it's that we've lost sight of how interconnected they were. Each clash was a thread in a larger tapestry, woven from ambition, innovation, and survival. And while it's easy to focus on the flashy land battles, the Agincourts and the Hastings, the truth is, the sea was often the real arbiter of destiny. Control the waves, and you controlled the wealth, the food, the very lifelines of nations. That's why these 25 battles matter. They're not just footnotes, they're the hidden hinges of history, the moments when the future pivoted on a single command, a lucky wind, or a burst of flame across the water. And in understanding them, we don't just learn about the past, we see the echoes of their lessons in every naval strategy, every trade dispute, every silent contest for power that still plays out on the world's oceans today. As we've seen, the medieval seas were just as fierce and consequential as any battlefield on land, where empires rose and fell not on the strength of their armies, but on the skill of their admirals, the cunning of their shipwrights, and the courage of sailors who braved storms and steel alike. These 25 forgotten battles are more than just footnotes. They're proof that history's tides were shaped by overlooked moments where a single decision, a sudden shift in the wind, or a burst of Greek fire could alter the fate of nations. Think of Venice's desperate stand at Chioggia, where a dying republic clung to survival by turning its own lagoon into a weapon, or the Ottomans' painful lessons at Modon, where defeat taught them how to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries to come. What makes these clashes so compelling isn't just the drama. It's the way they force us to rethink what we know about the medieval world. We picture knights in castles, sieges on grassy plains, but the truth is, some of the era's most pivotal struggles happened far from shore, where wooden hulls creaked under the weight of ambition. The sea was the ultimate equalizer. A Viking king could drown in the same waters that made him mighty. A humble Genoese crossbowman could humble a fleet of knights, and a city like Constantinople could defy annihilation not with walls, but with flaming siphons mounted on ships. And that's the real takeaway. These battles weren't just about who controlled a patch of water. They decided which cultures thrived, which technologies spread, even which languages we speak today. Had Alfonso the Wise's fleet not burned at Algeciras, Spain might have focused eastward, leaving the Atlantic unexplored. Had Roger of Loria lost at Cape Orlando, Sicily's identity could have been erased. The ripple effects are endless, hiding in plain sight, in our trade routes, our borders, even our cuisines. The medieval sea wasn't just a battlefield, it was a cauldron where the modern world was stirred. So the next time you see a map, skip the land for a moment. Trace the coastlines, the straits, the islands where these forgotten fights unfolded. Behind every quiet harbor or rocky shore, there's likely a story of fires, ships in the night, of arrows blotting out the sun, of empires lost and won on the waves. If you enjoyed this voyage into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners. Drop a comment below telling us which battle shocked or inspired you the most. Was it the ingenuity at Chioggia, the tragedy of Algeciras, or the sheer audacity of Esvalda? And set sail with us again soon, because history, like the sea, is vast, and we've only just begun